Hey y'all, and welcome back. Welcome if you're new. I'm Tiffany. This is our small town life. Welcome to my kitchen. We are going to pickle some squash today. So we have squash coming in like crazy. If you know, you know. Once it starts, you just about can't keep up with it. We've been eating fried squash and sauteed squash, and we have squash to preserve. So we're going to pickle it today. I love pickled squash probably more than I like pickled cucumbers. This is what we're going to do today is a bread and butter type recipe. And you could do this with cucumbers as well, but I prefer the squash. We're going to do squash and zucchini. I have another pickled squash recipe that we did last year. I'll leave it down in the description box in case you want to check it out. I have a video on that, but we're going to work on this one today. Fletcher's over here hanging out with us. I think Audrey's going to help me, and we're going to pickle some squash. So let's get to it. You talking to us? What are you saying over there? Do you like squash? To get started, I have my clean squash and zucchini, and I'm going to slice those up. I like to go for about a 1/4 inch, sometimes even up to 1/2 inch slices, just because that's what I prefer. And I actually like for the squash to be a little bit smaller than this one, but you can cut these however you like. I'm going to go ahead and get these all sliced up and moved over into a bowl. You'll hear me say in just a minute that I think the recipe calls for 10 cups, but I'm not sure it does. I went back and checked. You're looking for about 10 cups of sliced vegetables. I had a little bit more than that just because that's the squash and zucchini that I had that I needed to preserve. So, and I'll mention this again, but I made my brine and then I had to make a little bit more just to be able to fill up all of my jars with the squash and zucchini that we had because y'all, we have tons of it right now. On this particular day when we were pickling this squash and zucchini, I decided not to add any sliced onion in with the mixture, but you absolutely could. If you wanted to slice some onion, you could count that in your 10 cups of sliced vegetables. And pickled onion is delicious. For whatever reason, on this day though, I decided I would just leave it out. I think I just knew that I had so much squash and zucchini to use that I didn't want to take up any space in the jar with the onions because we had so much, y'all, so much. Now, I can't remember. I feel like the recipe called for 10 cups of squash and zucchini. I can't remember exactly. I know that it about looks like this in my bowl. When my bowl is just a little over half full, it's about right. So that's what I've got here, and we're going to sprinkle 1/2 cup of salt over this. We're using kosher salt. You could use sea salt, just any kind of salt, but stay away from iodized for things like this, for your canning. So we're going to sprinkle about 1/2 cup of salt over this, cover it with water. Just put enough water to make sure everything's covered, and we're going to let it sit and soak for about 2 hours. The saltwater soak isn't something that I've always done, and it's not something that I always do depending on the recipe and how much time that I have. But I do think that it helps keep a little bit of a crispiness to your vegetable, and I'll share another trick with you in just a minute. So for this particular recipe and where our salt is coming from in this recipe, we're going to do the saltwater soak. That's 1/2 cup of salt, and I know it seems like a lot, but we will drain the water off. We won't rinse it, but we'll drain it, and a lot of the salt will go away with the water, and we'll be left with just enough for the recipe. Kid just brought me the rest of his string cheese. We're about 30 minutes away from our time to drain the water off of our squash. We're not going to rinse it. We're going to drain the water off and not rinse them. We're about 30 minutes away from that though, and I'm going to start getting some other things ready. So we're going to work on our pickling liquid and start heating that up on the stove. I also have my jars washed and in the oven. I like to sterilize mine by putting them in the oven on 250 for about 20 minutes or so. So those are in there. We're going to water bath this, and so I need to get my water bath canner out and get that heating up because everything's going to be hot. We're going to put our squash in the jars and then squash in the hot jars, fill it with hot liquid, and then put it into a hot water bath canner. So we're going to start getting some of these things ready. The pickling liquid is 3 cups of white vinegar, 3 cups of sugar, white sugar, and then 2 teaspoons, I'm looking at, I got my stuff sitting out, I'm looking at it, 2 teaspoons of turmeric, 2 teaspoons of celery seed, and 2 teaspoons of mustard seed. We're going to go ahead and get all that in a pot and get it heating up. That way it's ready to go. Oh, okay, go ahead. Just 1, 2 of each. Now that all of the ingredients for our pickling liquid are in the pot, we're going to bring that up to a boil and then reduce it to a simmer so that the sugar is dissolved and everything is ready to go in our jar. I took the jars out of the oven so they're nice and hot, and we're going to pack them with our squash and zucchini, just fitting as many in there as we can. We did drain that water off but didn't rinse them. And I'm using the end of a wooden spoon just to pack them down in the jar, make sure they're in there nice and tight. This recipe is for 6-pint jars, but like I mentioned earlier, I had some extra squash and zucchini, so I made a little extra of the pickling brine and ended up filling 7 jars. Another thing that you can do to help keep your pickles crispy is to add pickle crisp, and that's what we're sprinkling on the top here. It's 1/8 of a teaspoon per pint. Here's the thing though, y'all. I've come to appreciate the fact that homemade pickles just have a little bit of a different texture, especially if you're canning them to make them shelf stable. We're going to water bath can these, and that's in hot water, and they're going to get hot and the texture is going to change a little bit. And that's okay. I've actually come to appreciate the fact that home canned pickles just have a little bit of a different texture. And they certainly have a different taste than your store-bought pickles, and that's in a good way. Nothing beats these. Now you'll see us ladling in our pickling liquid. We're going to fill these jars to a 1/2 inch headspace, so that means 1/2 inch from the top of the jar. And then you'll see us wipe around the rim of the jar really well to make sure there's nothing sticky there or the seasonings aren't there. These, like the mustard seed, if there's one of those left on the edge of the jar, you won't get a good seal. So we just have to make sure that the rim of the jar is really clean before we start putting on flats and rings. You can see me there wiping around the edge of the rim of the jar with a paper towel with a little bit of vinegar on it. Now we're putting our flats and our rings on fingertip tight, and I did have those in some warm water as well so that the seal on the bottom of the lid would be nice and soft. And then these are going to go in the water bath canner, and as soon as it's up to a boil, we're going to water bath these for 15 minutes. You do want to make sure that the water completely covers the top of your jar. Now, I've done this many times without a water bath canner. You just need a pot that's deep enough that you can cover your jars with water. Our pickled squash is out of the water bath canner. We're just letting it cool and seal. So as it sits and starts to cool, the lid will suction down. Usually you'll hear it pop depending on what kind of flat you have, but it'll suction down, and the little button that's on the top that's raised will sink in, and that's how you know it's sealed. So we ended up with 7 pints. The recipe was for 6 pints, but I had enough squash and zucchini cut up that I could fill another jar, so I went ahead and made a little bit extra of the pickling liquid so that I could do 1 more jar. So we did 7 pints. It looks beautiful. We'll let it cool and seal, and then we'll put it in the pantry. Thanks for hanging out with us and canning some pickled squash today. I love you. I appreciate you. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, y'all.